Okay, everyone, I'm going to explain again how to embed quotations. So the first thing we want to look at is how to embed full sentence quotations. If we look at this quote, we can see that he only wore polished shoes is a complete sentence. So here's how we'd put it in. We'd have a comma, we'd have a capital letter, we'd have no punctuation inside of the quote. The only punctuation that we would leave inside the quote is if it's a question mark or an exclamation point. Even if there's something else in the book, like a period or a comma or ellipses, ... or a dash, we leave that off. And then that we put whatever punctuation we need for our sentence outside of the parentheses. We could, in fact, turn this period into a comma right here and say the author illustrates Tom's perfectionism with the description he only wore polished shoes, comma, which further describes him as a controlling character. Or we could have no punctuation if we wanted to say the author illustrates Tom's perfectionism with the description he only wore polished shoes, no punctuation, to show how controlling he was. But you don't have any punctuation in here unless it's a question mark or an exclamation point. If you have a says verb in your sentence, meaning you're attributing this quote directly to a person by using words like describes, illustrates, examines, you need to use the rules for a full sentence quotation. So Piggy shouts, that's a says verb, comma, capital letter, no punctuation mark in here unless it's a question mark or an exclamation point. Page number, you don't need to write page or PG. We know that's a page number. If this were a poem, that would be a line number, but you don't need to write line. We know what it is based on the genre that you're talking about. And then you have whatever punctuation you need out here. If we go back to our previous example, we can see that this word illustrates is also a says verb. So we need to follow these rules because it's a full sentence quotation and also because we're using a says verb. A partial sentence quotation is like where polished shoes, that's not a complete sentence. So when you're not using a complete sentence, you want to take off the punctuation marks, take off the quotation marks, and see what you would need. You wouldn't need a comma to say the author describes Tom's polished shoes, so you don't need a comma here. You wouldn't need a capital letter, so you don't need a capital letter here. And similarly, you don't have anything inside the end of the quote unless it's a question mark or an exclamation point. So again, if we took off the quotes, this would just say the author describes Tom's polished shoes, comma, emphasizing his perfectionism, which is a great sentence. So a good trick for quoting is take off the quotes, see if you would need a comma or a capital letter, and that's the amount of punctuation that you need. How or that, if that is before the quote, you need to use the rules for a partial sentence quotation. So if we look down here, Golding illustrates how Piggy yells at the others. Because we have how right before the verb, right before the quote, we don't need a comma or we do need a capital, but that's just because Piggy is a name. And again, we can use our trick. If we took the quotes off, it would say Golding illustrates how Piggy yells at the others, period. We wouldn't need a comma there, so we don't need a comma here now. And we never have anything inside the end of the quote except for an exclamation point or question mark. So we leave all that stuff off now too. If you have several partial quotations, well, let's just use our trick of taking the quotes off and see what we need. Take off that quote, and it says Tom is described as wearing polished shoes and never leaving the house without shaving first. Well, we wouldn't need a comma between wearing and polished shoes, so we don't need a comma now. This would just be the next word in a sentence, so it would not need to be capitalized. Nothing here. So there's no question mark or exclamation. We don't need anything right here because we're just continuing our sentence. And no comma, because if we would just say and never, we don't need a comma, we don't need a capital letter. And never leaving the house without shaving first. Nothing inside. But then we do want to continue our sentence. If we took this out, we would need to have a comma before emphasizing because this is a present participle. Here's the tricky part. We often do comma splices when we embed our quotes. So if the sentence is a comma splice when you take the quotes off, it's a comma splice with the quotes too. So if we look at this example sentence, Salinger portrays Holden's isolation. Well, remember, a comma splice is when we have two independent clauses, and Salinger portrays Holden's isolation. That's a complete sentence. That's an IC. I'm all alone, if we took the quotes off, would also be an IC, or a complete sentence. We can't just combine those two things with a comma. We need to add some words to connect the ideas. So we could say Salinger portrays Holden's isolation when he says comma, I'm all alone. And then it works just the way our other sentences work. I'm all alone is our IC. And then Salinger portrays Holden's isolation when he says is our DC. Again, the trick that you always want to remember, take the quotes off and see what kind of punctuation you would need, and that's what you should put in there.